Yo, what's up? So I've been perusing YouTube a little bit, and I came across a video by my favorite YouTubist, Growl, and he created this video called "The Biggest Mistakes Healers Make in Mythic Plus Dungeons," and he listed the top 10 things that healers need to do to be able to improve their gameplay in M Plus Dungeons. And that got me thinking about DPS, because that's probably my biggest forte. And so then I came up with the top 5 reasons, because of course we can't have 10 as a DPS. DPS is just too easy. Top 5 reasons and top 5 biggest mistakes that DPS make in M Plus Dungeons. And this is just generally going to be looking to improve your gameplay. It's not that big of a deal. And so let's jump into it. So number 5, we're going to go with prepositioning. So this is talked about a lot whenever you're looking at range DPS in general, talking about making sure that you're maximizing your ability to be able to cast on mobs, making sure that you're maximizing your ability to be able to put damage globals into the mobs. But it's also relevant for melee DPS. Typically for melee DPS, it's going to look a little bit different. It's min-maxing your positioning relative to when swirlies are going to be coming out. It's min-maxing your position whenever circles are going to be coming out on the mobs that are going to prevent you from having uptime. It's also prepositioning to make sure that you're going to be able to have the best ability to be able to maintain uptime on those mobs and dodge frontals and keep yourself safe a little bit. And then for range DPS, of course, by making sure that you're able to have and connect globals and preposition really well, you're going to be able to deal a lot more damage to the mobs. This happens for both ranged and melee DPS. And of course, dealing damage and maintaining uptime on the mobs is one of the most important things for damage dealers, because dealing more damage over the course of the entire dungeon is going to speed up your dungeon, going to make your group more consistent, and it's also going to make you a more enticing player to bring back to your group. The number 4 thing, and I made a video specifically talking about this, but I'm going to kind of bring this back up again, is priority damage versus overall damage. One of the biggest mistakes that players will make in general is believing that AoE DPS is the most important thing in M plus situations, and that's not always true. Now, it might be true to either top the meter or to look good for that person that you're trying to impress in your group to get reinvited to the group, but that's not always true for trying to time the key. Priority damage and having a good balance of AoE versus single target damage is very important. Whenever you look at just a dungeon as a whole, about 40% of the dungeon is spent fighting bosses. These are typically going to be single target bosses. Now, that's not always true, but more often than not, these are going to be single target encounters. And so thus, having a good balance of single target versus AoE is very important. That's why some of the best Mythic Plus builds and some of the best Mythic Plus specs lose very little from like their raid build to actually go and do M+. Because whenever you're actually losing very little single target damage to play for your maximum potential for AoE, or very close to it, say like 95% of your maximum potential for AoE, that's important. Additionally, whenever you're talking about priority damage versus AoE, specs that deal full 100% of their AoE while continuing to do priority damage on a mob are very good. And that's why some specs over time, I'm thinking about things like Outlaw Rogue, I'm thinking about things like Arcane Mage in the current season going into the War Within, Shadow Priest with Psychic Link, Havoc Demon Hunter, like all of these specs lose very little to play for 100% of their AoE damage, and that allows these specs to be a lot better just in the long term. Now, there's some specs that historically have had problems where you're basically talenting out of all of your single target to talent full AoE. I'm thinking about like Aflock, I'm thinking about like Assassination Rogue pre-rework, where if you like end up giving up all of your single target and all of your priority damage to just play for AoE, even if your AoE is super spectacular, you're going to really struggle on boss encounters. And I think that in general, this is a big mistake that players make, is just over talenting into AoE damage. All right, so number 3, I have this in my notes in all caps is interrupt, but it's also utilizing your utility and stops and also understanding what your spec does / your class can do. So for interrupts, there's typically going to be a meta about what you can and can't interrupt. And whenever you think about some of the dungeons, you have to kind of look at them piece by piece and understand like the cooldown on what the casts are. So for example, the first area of Arakara, there's some mobs that have a 12-second interrupt. And so then you know that you're going to be forced to put a melee DPS on that interrupt every single time. Otherwise, your mage or whatever might not be able to get it. Alternatively, there's also mobs in that dungeon that have casts that are on a 20-second interrupt, and that's optimal for a mage or an augmentation evoker. Then there are some casts that are on a 24-second interrupt, and that'll be optimal for like a hunter or a warlock or somebody else with a 24-second interrupt. So understanding like what the meta will be for what you can and should kick is important, and then also understanding like how to rotate your interrupts correctly onto specific mobs. That will actually help you out in the long run. The best advice that I can have for being able to learn this is probably download the nameplate cooldown weak aura and then kind of diligently look at what the CD of casts are going to be. That will help you really understand and analyze where your kick is supposed to be going in a lot of the times. In addition to that, utilizing your utility and stops, that's a really big one that players until a high level don't really understand. Average players will end up throwing their stops or using them at a really weird time or not pressing them at all. And I see this a lot whenever you're pugging in LFG, where you're just actually not pressing your stops at all. Asking a Shadow Priest, for example, to press Fear, you may as well just expect them to never press Fear for the entire dungeon. So I think it's one of those situations where knowing what needs to be stopped, knowing where's the right situation to have stops, and then also having like an interrupt tracker to make sure that you know when everybody's kick is on CD is really important for pressing your stops as well. This is especially true in the War Within, where stops actually make the mobs recast their abilities. And so like tracking everybody's interrupt and making sure that somebody's not going to accidentally kick into your stop is important. And like having that presence of mind and like, you know, making sure that your Omni CD is set up correctly, making sure that your interrupt tracker is set up correctly as a DPS is very important, because DPS just as a general role has a lot more ability to be able to like CC and interrupt mobs, especially whenever you're playing like a melee DPS. So making sure that you are aware of what you're supposed to be doing and when you're supposed to be doing it is a crucial point. And it's one of the biggest mistakes I definitely see from DPS. Number 2, defensive usage. I think that this is something that has gotten a lot more talked about over the course of Dragonflight, as defensives have been a lot more important and impactful just as a whole. This is still going to remain true in the War Within, and having good defensive usage is important. It's not something that you can necessarily script out, although scripted defensive usage is something that you see from time to time, particularly in like great push level groups. But just having the knowledge and the presence of mind to plan out your defensives for the next 1, 2, potentially even 3 minutes of a boss fight is really important. Also having that level of communication and rapport with your healer to know whenever they're going to be pressing something on you versus whenever you should be pressing something for yourself. Also, like, when is Zephyr going to be coming out? When is like Anti-Magic Zone going to be coming out? What are we going to be spirit linking? Stuff like that. There's a bunch of, group externals that can be pressed as well, and having a good understanding of where those group externals should go, and also how to keep yourself alive in pretty much all situations is an important thing. I think a good example of this is like Algathar Academy. Whenever you were looking at Croth, the meta for that was to actually go to 5 stacks. Very few classes could go to 5 stacks of that Sonic Screech debuff without any help. There were some exceptions, like Mage could do it, but in general, not every class could actually go to 5 stacks that Sonic Screech debuff without a little bit of help. So, assigning things like Rescue, assigning things like Zephyr, or knowing whenever people are going to be pressing like a group external, like a Devo Aura, something like that, and making sure that you know when to be pressing your defensives correctly is a huge deal. And that's something that you see like even like low range title M+ players, like very good players by every sense of the word. That's where you go from being like a low range title player to being like an elite level player, is just having that presence of mind to really map out your defensives minutes in advance. Because it's one of those things too that it's really easy to press your defensives on cooldown or kind of press them reactively as you see the cast of the 6-second cast really start. But it's another thing to be looking at your timers and knowing, oh, okay, this is what I'm going to do here, this is what I'm going to do here. And honestly, too, sometimes you have to do like a one-shot calculator to make sure that you're able to live stuff. That's a bit out of the scope of this necessarily, but that's also something that you're going to have to do whenever you start to push and become a better player. Now, the number one mistake that I see DPS players make in dungeons is they don't use their cooldowns on CD. This is something that should be taught to DPS players the moment that they start doing dungeons, is always use your offensive cooldowns on CD. This is one of those things that, especially with the travel time that happens in M+ dungeons, holding your offensive CDs is almost always a mistake. There are a couple of spots where you can actually argue that using your offensive CDs or holding them can be optimal, but in general, it's a lot more optimal to get more uses of your offensive CDs than the optimal uses of your offensive CDs. It's one of those things that I would say, if you don't know when to press them on CD. And if you determine after the fact that that was a bad press, you'll know in the future, and the situations in the future that you're like, okay, this was a bad press. But starting from a baseline of I'm pressing my CD on cooldown here, and if it was overkill or if we didn't really need it here, that's fine. But this is one of those things too that in between your trash packs, you probably have 15, 20, 30 seconds of runtime in between the packs. And so, like, even if you press your cooldown at the very end of a trash pack and say it is a 2-minute CD, you're only going to have it on effective, like the effective cooldown is only going to be 1 minute and 30 seconds. And that's like a very valuable way of thinking about how to use your offensive CDs and making sure that you're getting some of this CDR by non-combat time, because you can just like press your offensive CD whenever a boss is at 15%, but you have a minute of runtime or travel time ahead of you. You may as well just ship it, and you're basically getting 1 minute of CDR for free. All right, so those were the top 5 mistakes and the biggest mistakes that I see from DPS players in M+. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on some of the biggest mistakes that you see in M+ dungeons down in the comment section below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.